Howdy folks, it's Phil from One Wall Studio again, and this time I'm reviewing another Audio Assault plugin. This is a instrument plugin for the first time that I can remember from Audio Assault, and it's known as Druminator. Now, when you load it up as either a VSTi or a VST3i or what have you, depending on your system, you can see that it'll load by default a regular kit composed of kick 1, pork pie snare, all the toms, all the overheads, and the snare trigger sample and the kick trigger sample. There's a whole bunch of really crazy, interesting things that this plugin does that I'm going to walk through this whole video. So I'm going to review it for sure, but in order to fully review it, you have to understand that there are so many features baked into this plugin, it's absurd. So, firstly, I'll have you know that I'm not EQing this or mixing this in any way, even though there's the options to. So all of its default values, the default preset, and everything, and I'll get more into that later and what that means. There's a couple of things with this plugin that need some smoothing out, but we'll get to that when we burn that bridge. You'll see there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here on the mixer section of the plugin. You've got mapping at the top right, as always. You can change it from addictive drums, backwards, general MIDI, BFD, easy drummer, superior drummer, Steven Slate, general MIDI. Now, some things you'll notice about this are you have a mute on every channel, you have a solo on every channel, a phase flip on every channel. Below that, you have a switch to engage the EQ section, engage the effects section, or engage the reverb section. And you can do all of these simultaneously, or you can pick and choose, which is really cool. It means you only have to really process in the plugin. Now you'll also notice that every individual channel has a pan, overhead direct, which is the sound of the overheads, room direct, which is the sound of the room, and the room and overhead channels on their own also have very interesting things going on. So this is the overhead channel. Select the amount of snare in it. Kick. Toms. And the width of the overheads. Stereo, mono. That also indirectly affects the overhead direct signal. So, when you have this whole setup here, it really makes it interesting because you can practically control mic bleed without having independent control over mic bleed from the different toms into kick or toms into snare. You just get overhead mic bleed into the snare channel and stuff like that. It's kind of very interesting, and it's something that I haven't really seen before, but if you've worked with replacing drums, you'll know that it works just like blending in an overhead sample of just one single drum. So, you also have a ride hi-hat channel where you can control the level of the hats and the ride, the panning of both, and a room channel with another width control. Cymbal levels. Tom levels. Kick and snare levels. And then the toms You have control over the panning of every individual tom, direct overhead signal, room signal, in my opinion, toms sound better with a little bit of room, but not too much room, which is a really good feature to have there. And then you also have, distinct from other particular drum samplers, you have options for trigger channels. So while the kick and the snare channels have more natural feel, as if they were sampled from a regular drum, this feels like it was sampled from a drum sample replacement software. So, pretty funny how that works. But they also have independent control of EQ, reverb, and effects on their own. Now these have overhead send, which sends them to this channel, and room send, which sends them to the room channel. So overall, once you get the idea of the routing down, there's a whole lot under the hood that you can explore. And what's really cool about it is, it gives you so much stuff to play with in one single plugin that I haven't found myself needing to actually use the advanced routing features for the output chains, because you can have up to 18 outs, which in reality works more like stereo. So you can have each of these channels on their own output and control them independently, which would be really cool. But you don't really have to do that because you have EQ channels, effects channels, and reverb on every single individual channel, controllable completely independently of every other one, which means you essentially have 9 independent instances of a reverb with functions, EQ curves, and width controls with mix knobs. Same with effects. You have a compressor and a drive, which is analog modeled. You have a transient shaper. You have a punch knob and a clipper on every individual channel, which means this plugin can be kind of a CPU hog at times. Same with the EQ. You have filters and EQ curves for 4 different bands, and that's for every individual sample that can be played. So there's a whole bunch of choices when it comes to the triggered sounds, which is good because if you're mixing metal, which is most likely what this is going to be for, then you're definitely going to want a triggered sample of some kind that augments the original. Now, I've had a couple of presets made that don't really use the triggers, but only use the more natural samples. But for really clicky, punchy, high-impact metal, you're probably going to want to experiment with these different samples and see what you can add. But there's some that just sound really cool, like the huge kick can sound massive with like an 80s style sound. Let's hear how it sounds by default in a mix. So that doesn't sound too bad. What happens if we switch to one of the other presets? You'll notice that when I switched to the dry metalcore preset, it set the snare and the kick to both be sent to their independent effects channels. The effects channel was changed because when you make a preset in this, it saves every single setting from every single channel and module, including the EQ, the effects, the reverb, all of it. And the state in which you save the preset determines what's active and what's not. So if I were to uncheck this effects and then save it as a preset, when I load it up again, that would no longer be checked. Really cool. So in this one, it also seems like their toms are really wide panned, some room direct and some overhead direct. Lots of overhead direct on the snare, etc. So it's called dry metalcore. Let's hear how it sounds. Right away, I can tell you that it definitely sounds different than the default, probably because of all the processing that's going on. So you see all this stuff over here is EQ'd. Everything but the kick is EQ'd. Even the kick sample is EQ'd, and the snare trigger is out of phase. Now, the snare is the pork pie, the kick is kick 1, the kick trigger is metalcore 2, and the snare trigger is metalcore 1. So, when you click this, hit the snare, you're getting a blend of the pork pie snare and the triggered snare, same with kick. And you'll see that there's a little bit less kick than there is kick trigger on the faders. Not really sure why it's inverting the phase on it, because I don't hear all that much of a difference. But there's also a 130 millisecond sample delay, so it's not actually hitting the sample until 130 milliseconds afterwards. So either it's kind of using the sample as a slapback. Anyhow, on to the next one, which is kind of more of an affected signal. It's called Heavy Levy, and this is, again, one of the default presets that comes with the program. Ooh, that sounds really interesting. Now, there's some processing on this one on the master bus. Let's see what it's doing in terms of effects. It doesn't look like it's EQ'd, but it looks like it's got a 33% blend of this compressor over here, which is slowish attack, fastest release, 5.9 ratio, and like negative 29.3 threshold, 5 dB of makeup gain. So it's really doing nothing but compressing on the master in terms of effects. Everything's EQ'd on this, so again, you don't even have to really leave the plugin for processing. It's all right there. Let's listen to what Metalcore Kit is. Ooh. I like that a lot better than dry metalcore. I like it quite a bit. I personally would turn up the kick a little bit. But it's definitely a good sounding preset. I'd probably use that one if I didn't make my own. Up next is Natural. We'll see how natural they sound. Oh, wow. That does sound pretty natural. The toms aren't even panned. What is this? Wow, so yeah, that's a very, very natural, as in no processing, no adjustments, no leveling. This is kind of like the default. Natural 2, on the other hand, is a different set of triggers and samples, so you get an even less processed sound, if that's possible. Natural 1 has that deep thumpy kick. Crazy how different it sounds. Lastly, we have the rock preset. That's a very interesting sound for a rock kit. Let's go to a different section. Honestly, I'd probably increase the sustain of the snare a lot more if this is a rock mix. That's just my personal preference. Up next, we have a couple of my personal presets that I've made just to show off what you can kind of do with this full setup. And I'll, of course, leave them in the description if anybody wants them, because I mean, if you want. This is what I call Phil's 80s power metal trip. Basically, it's based off of a whole bunch of power metal that I've been listening to recently from, like, the 80s and 90s, and you'll see why. So this is the preset. You can tell it's very 80s power metal because of the huge room reverb and like the gated toms and all that stuff. Basically just the size of it makes it feel like the 80s. I also have the aggressive roomy kit. You'll notice that when I load a preset, sometimes it doesn't change all the settings, or it feels like some of the settings go to default value. That's one of the problems that I've seen with this plugin. For now, with version 1.0 or whatever it is, because I got it literally on release, it seems like it has that problem. It did it again. There we go. There's my roomy kit. Here's my basic metal kit, which I made just as a starting point for the sound that I want. Now, I made that because I felt like it fits pretty well, just in the context of most any mix, honestly. But, yeah. You'll notice that oftentimes when I stop it and then have to play it, I have to reload the preset. So making presets has almost become necessary for me in order to keep my settings, which is a shame because otherwise I like the sounds you can get out of this. You can get some really good 80s and 90s metal sample sounding sounds, and you don't even have to leave the plugin to add reverbs. And check this out. Alright, so my DAW crashed because of trying to remove an instance of Druminator in the regular version. It happens with the VST3 version too. Honestly, I like the plugin, but it can get pretty awkward when that happens. Reinstantiate that. So as I was saying, here it can show you what the actual name is in the VST3 versions. Since VST3 allows right-click menus, you can check out what the parameter is for an individual channel. Say, snare mix reverb, which would be verb 288 on here. Go into whatever you're using to automate, search that, make it this, and for example, during this slower breakdown here section, I can just automate it so that the reverb in plugin increases significantly. So you can see there that it becomes immensely easier to adjust the reverb. in the VST3 version because you can just right click and see it, show the track envelope by clicking on it. Although that didn't work super well for me. An example would be when I try to do it here. It just shows mixer parameter 0, which is not the one we want. So that seems a little bit buggy, but that could just be Reapers working with VST3. Anyhow, I have created the 80s. The cool thing about this is, with the reverb the way it is, you can adjust the size to make it massive, the decay to make it feel really, really long. You can dampen it, which has the effect of making it feel like a really cool, weird, like, clamped down on reverb. You can increase the density, the early reflections, the pre-delay, all of it. You can also adjust an EQ with a cut at certain frequencies. So if I want to make it just like a body that explodes outwards. You can do that. With the effects, you can drive things as hard or as soft as you want. You can adjust the attack and sustain, cut out the entire sustain and make everything attack. Which can lead to some really interesting effects. You can push the punch on everything and clip the heck out of every single channel. And when you do that, you'll find that it sounds like a punchy, distorted mess. But the fact that you can get to that point and push it so hard, you'll notice there's some slowdown on my system. Again, that's because it takes a lot of effort to use all the built-in processing, and for whatever reason, it just doesn't seem that optimized. I'm only using about 18% of my CPU usage, which some decent amp sims use up that much on my computer. So it doesn't make sense that this would be bringing my computer to a grinding halt, although that could be for any reason whatsoever. It might just be my DAW, it might be my computer. But it just doesn't feel all that optimized. I was getting slowdown especially hard on my friend Roger's preset that he sent me since we were trading presets. Look what happens when all these things are engaged. Major slowdown, right? I don't understand how it could be that glitchy. But, again, it's an extremely new piece of software from Audio Assault, and they always improve on the stuff that they release. With that in mind, I highly recommend you get it when it's on sale. Right now it's on sale for about $9, which is what I got it for. Super worth it in my opinion, especially if you need samples just to augment. As Roger was saying, the kick samples alone would be worth it for $9, especially to augment with. Check it out. That's a really solid kick. But the fact that you also get to EQ everything, have special effects, so you don't really need anything outside the box, except maybe a limiter to catch peaks. This thing is a fully functional package with a couple of glitches, and once those are smoothed out, this could be easily one of the best entry-level drum samplers ever for metal, because it just works. And I'll be honest, I like it way better than every free offering I've ever used. It can sound kind of unrealistic sometimes, but if you know what you're doing with velocities and compression, you can really get something good out of it just with a couple of presets. And again, you can get a huge range of sounds out of it. I only tried to go for more metal stuff, but your mileage may vary, and honestly, I hope you give it a chance, especially while it's on sale for $9, because once they smooth out some of the problems with it, you're going to be left with an incredibly diverse offering of samples to use. Big ring, fatter, mad, metalcore, snap, snare, thrash, and a whole bunch of kick samples too. That was big fat bass, huge, kick, metalcore 2, metalcore 1. So yeah, you can see that it's definitely tailored towards metal, but you can get a whole bunch of old school sample sounds. I got, just by messing with some a couple times, like a really cool Roland T808 kind of style sound. I've also gotten straight up Andy Sneap style samples, like in here, not even just in the box, but in the plugin. So you can get anything with the built-in features here. Like, there are a couple times I thought, oh, that sample sounds a little bit too muddy, or, oh, that sample sounds a little bit lacking in low end, and I really like a good beefy kick. So I went to the EQ section, went to like 70 hertz, and just cranked it. And it sounded so good with the fat low end like that, that I didn't even bother to output anything to an individual channel in my DAW, which I could do, but I'm keeping it all here, because you know what? This plugin does it just as well as anything else will. And once the CPU issues are resolved, and everything, you know, all the presets don't have to be reloaded over and over again, every time you press play and stop, it'll be a great plugin to use. In the meantime, I recommend you get it just to wait it out, but if you don't feel like it's worth the hassle, you don't have to get it, but I would say the sounds are great, and if you're just getting started, while it doesn't have grooves yet, so you do have to manually program your own MIDI or take it from another drum sampler, out of the box, especially with the ability to share presets, which I've already started doing with a whole bunch of my friends, you can get a reasonable amount of mileage out of this one drum sampling plugin. So check it out. Buy this plugin if you find it worthy. Honestly, for under $10 right now while it's on sale, I do not think you could possibly go wrong. Now keep in mind, if you're watching this at a really late date and it's up to $50, I would wait and see if any of the problems that were initially there have been tackled, if they've released more samples, and if they've done anything else, you know, just in general to improve the health of the plugin, so to speak. But yeah, I think it's pretty great. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and leave a comment. Feel free to like it, subscribe to it. I mean, to me, not to the plugin, but you can do that too. This has been Phil Zio signing off. It's pretty much 3 in the morning right now, so I'm exhausted as always, and I'll see you next time.